I'm Noah Abrams, and welcome to The Days Between, the show where I talk to my friends, people I admire, and people I want to better understand about success, failure, happiness, and misery, as well as all the other elements that make up a life well lived. Along the way, we'll look at mental, spiritual, and physical health, and when life didn't go as planned, the steps they took to get themselves from A to B and beyond. This week, I'm speaking with Mark Mahoney. As a tattooer, Mark needs no introduction. A pioneer of the single needle style, his work has inspired artists and set a standard for decades. An afternoon at the beach as a young boy set Mark on a path which has seen him bridge the gap between outsider and popular culture, helping to bring the art form into the mainstream. It was with the outlaw motorcycle clubs of Massachusetts where Mark would first practice his craft, saving members a trip to neighboring Rhode Island. After a short stint in art school, he found himself in New York City in the late 70s, expanding his body of work on a clientele that included some of the most notorious musicians in history. With tattooing illegal in Manhattan, Mark made his way to the Pike in Long Beach, California, where he cut his teeth and was exposed to single needle tattoos, popular with Chicano artists, but shunned by the larger tattoo community. Mark would eventually land in Los Angeles, where he set up shop on the Sunset Strip, but the journey there wasn't without his fair share of tragedy. During the course of our conversation, we discussed kicking Charles Bukowski's ass, the East Coast-West Coast hip-hop rivalry of the 90s, and the Shamrock Social Club, his home for the last 22 years. The term legend gets thrown around a lot, but when it comes to Mark, it's difficult to think of a more accurate way to describe him, save only for the word humble. It is my privilege to present Mark Mahoney on The Days Between. So I'm here in Los Angeles, California with Mark Mahoney. You are very much identified with the Sunset Strip where we are right now, but you are not from here.
I am indeed not from here. I am a nice kid from suburban Boston who got lost along the way and found himself like a lot of other people on the Sunset Strip seeking fame and fortune, I guess.
So you're born and raised in Boston?
Yeah, I was, yeah.
Any siblings?
Yeah, I had two sisters. One passed pretty recently, God rest her soul, and one beautiful sister living in the house that we grew up in that's crumbling around her. And got to go back and see her soon. I miss her.
Tell me about growing up in Boston.
I had a wonderful childhood, running around. You could go where you wanted. Your parents didn't have to worry about you getting kidnapped and everything. And I remember I was probably 7 and I wanted to go to the record store. It was, a couple of towns over. And I asked my mother, could I take the bus and go? So, fuck it, go ahead. So, 7 years old, I get on the bus, go across town to buy my little 45, I hang on Sloopy, So you could do things then as a kid. There was more freedom. I had the Catholic parents and lived through the JFK assassination. It was a defining moment in my childhood. Lying in front of the black and white television watching the funeral. And my dad, great artist, could draw anything, was teaching me how to draw the thing that he probably drew when he was 7 years old, biplanes, So, yeah, I have, bittersweet memories of that funeral.
Were your parents religious?
Yes, my father went to church. He was an usher. But my mother didn't go to church, but she was equally religious, I guess. She would pray a lot. She was depressed, She spent a lot of my childhood on the couch smoking cigarettes, She would just say that the Irish are given to the melancholy. That was how she explained it.
Now, were you drawing from a young age?
Oh, yeah, I always drew, And you talk about those long winters. You're in the house. I would draw stuff.
What kind of things were you drawing?
I started off drawing like the Revolutionary War, I think. And then I started drawing choppers. One of the guys from the neighborhood, older guys, came to California and came back with a chopper. And I was obsessed with it and started drawing choppers when I was maybe 9 or 10. And got obsessed with that, bike culture. And then a guy up the street gave me his collection of 50s car magazines. And that got me all gone on the 50s and 50s custom cars. So I think those were early influences for me. The first tattoo I ever remember seeing up close was my dad and I would go to the beach, and I'm taking a nap, and I hear this guy come up, and he's talking to my dad, and I open my eyes, and I'm looking at this big naked lady on his calf. I was like, wow, that's cool, man. That's like the coolest shit I ever saw. Besides the fact that it was a naked lady, it was, on his leg, and this cool, smudgy blue color, and I just was gone. I thought that was so cool. And that was my dad's friend, Sharky Sullivan, a gangster from over there.
How common was it to see tattoos at that time?
It was very rare, That's the thing. It was a little later on when I became, more interested. I would take the subway to downtown Boston to see this sword swallower that would set up by the T station and swallow swords with his shirt off. And he had the most beautiful tattoos. He had the Pharaoh's horses on his chest and American flags. And he had been a carnival, tattooed guy, tattooer, and sword swallower, did pretty much everything. And fast forward 25, 30 years later, I get to meet him out here, Captain Don Leslie, and we got to be friends, He was such a character, but instrumental in I think, really wanting to do tattoos, was just seeing how beautiful his were.
Now, do you remember the first time you walked into a tattoo studio?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That was the life-changing moment. I went down with Mark Mahoney, who was like the leader of our little greaser gang and a few years older, so he could get tattooed. He was 18, I was probably 15, and because it was illegal in Massachusetts, we'd have to drive to Rhode Island, and you wanted to get a really good tattoo. Everybody knew that it was this guy, Buddy Mott, in Newport, Rhode Island. So we drove down there, and I walked into that shop, and it changed my life. It was just so fucking cool, I don't think Buddy had changed anything in the shop since he opened it up in probably 1940 or something. It was like stepping back in time, and he had hand-painted everything on the walls, all the flash. It was gorgeous, man, but what an experience, what an atmosphere, it just enveloped me. And, it was 100% clear that that's what I had to be doing, And Mark, who I went down with, also wanted a tattoo, and he was a great artist, and he joined the Navy shortly thereafter, and he ended up getting an apprenticeship in Florida with a guy named Cool Hand Luke, and then Mark came back and taught me, and Mark has had a shop in New Hampshire since 1977, and he's never used a stencil or a pattern. He's drawn everything on with a pen this whole time. Pretty impressive feat.
So Mark taught you, and then did you go to school?
I had gone to art school for a minute, and I hated it. All the cool kids were leaving for New York when I was starting off at art school. Actually, they were photographers, Nan Golden and David Armstrong. They were my only friends at school, and they were both leaving for New York. So I knew I would end up heading down there. But I started tattooing at this motorcycle clubhouse, the Centaurs, and they would lend me out to the Hells Angels in Lowell and Salem, and it was a wonderful time, man. The guys treated me so good, and I was just fucking learning, but I guess I saved them a trip to Rhode Island, and I would draw everything on And they could get whatever they want. And man, it was wild. It was fun.
And then at what point did you make your way to New York?
So I bounced back and forth to New York for a while. And then in 79, I moved down there full time. No, 78, I moved down there full time and was there for a couple of years till I came out here.
And you were tattooing in New York?
Yeah. Tattooing out of our apartment on Elizabeth Street in the Lower East Side.
What kind of clientele?
You know, people from CBGBs. One of my roommates managed bands, and that's how I got to know Johnny Thunders and, you know, Sid Vicious. Nancy Spungen had left her cat with my neighbor, and she said, this was, you know, a year or so before I got there, she left her cat there and said she was going to London to get Johnny Rotten and bring him back. But she ended up coming back with Sid, and to me, I think she got lucky. Sid's a much nicer guy, man.
So how did you end up in California?
So Massachusetts, illegal. Manhattan, illegal. And every time, particularly in the biker world or the musician world, that I saw a really good tattoo, they were always from California. And the Centaurs were throwing a going away party for me so I could tattoo and raise money to come out here. And there's a guy visiting from another club from California. I think he was Angel. I can't remember. But he looked like a Californian, long blonde hair, and had these beautiful color tattoos. I'm like, man, those tattoos are beautiful. Where'd you get them? And he said, I got them in California. I'm like, well, where at? Because I'm going out there. He goes, I got them at the Pike in Long Beach. He said, but don't bother going there, kid. They only hire people that were good. I'm like, this motherfucker. And then, you know, a week later, I was working at the Pike, so fuck him. I was waiting for him to come in and get tattooed.
Now tell me how you got the job at the Pike.
I went down into Burt Grimm's, and Colonel Todd was there, me an old-timer, and said, I'm looking for a job. He says, you got your own equipment? I said, I do. Where'd you learn? I told him from my friend. He said, okay, come back tomorrow and bring somebody to tattoo, and we'll see what happens. So only person I knew out here was my friend Eddie Devine from Boston, who was in the Merchant Marines. And I told him, Eddie, you got to let me tattoo you. He goes, I don't want to fucking tattoo. I'm like, no, Eddie, this is serious. You really got to let me. So I fucking pounded on Eddie, and thank God he let me tattoo him the next day. I did a heart with a anchor and a cross on his leg, you know, in color. And I guess it came out good enough where I was working a couple days later. Todd told me years later that I had the job before I started tattooing because I drew the pattern on. You know, I guess that was, you know, rare that people could draw like that.
It's not uncommon these days to see single needle tattoos. Mm-hmm. But at the time, they weren't very common.
No, I had never seen one till I got to California, you know. And that first day at that shop at the Pike, there was a girl there who had beautiful work from Freddie Negretti, who works with me now and who's my, you know, tattoo idol, and Jack Rudy, who I lucky enough to work with later on and learned, you know, a shit ton from. And she had, you know, beautiful color work from Ed Hardy and Bob Roberts. So on the first day, I got to see who was who pretty much in California. But when I saw that single needle black and gray stuff, it flipped my wig because that was like the way I drew, you know. And when I was a kid, I'd get the new box of Crayolas, and after a week, the black would be like 3/4 of an inch long and the colors would be untouched. So I've always kind of thought like that.
What was the reception when you started changing over to that style? Were people into it?
That's a very good question, and I don't think people really know how resistant the tattoo community was to single needle. Colonel Todd wouldn't let us use it. It was just gonna fall out. It wasn't real tattoos. It was just scratching. You know, he would acknowledge that Freddie and Jack's tattoos were nice, but he was convinced, and most established tattooers were then, and I'm sure there's still a couple now that were convinced that single needle was just, they called them scratchers, and it just wasn't going to last, you know. And, you know, there might have been a little bit of racism in that it came from the Chicano community, you know, and most of the tattooers in those days were all white guys. I don't know, but there was a real strong anti-single needle thing for a long time that you had to, you know, kind of fight through.
And for people that aren't familiar, can you explain the technical difference between single needle and a larger gauge?
Yeah. So a single needle is like it sounds. It's one single needle, so it makes a lot finer line. Most tattoos at the time were done with the grouping of 5 needles bunched together, so you made a thicker, bolder line, you know, and all of that, you know, bolder line stuff usually came with color and had a totally different look than this fine line single needle stuff that was shaded in, you know, soft grays and stuff. They were pretty far away from one another and how they looked on the skin. After I left the Pike, I went in partners with this cool guy, Jimmy Carranza, rest in peace, in a tattoo shop in San Pedro. And Jimmy had kind of grown up with Jack Rudy and, you know, was a friend of his, so I got introduced by them. And he had this cool little shop in this cool little town, San Pedro, and I was, you know, stoked to be over there, but business was fucking slow, you know. All the white guys were strung out on heroin and all the Chicanos were on PCP and, you know, even my partner. So business was rough, you know. I happened to be having this good day one time when these 3 like clean-cut college girls came in to get tattooed. And so I'm having a good time tattooing these girls, and this local wino guy comes in, and he's acting up, you know, and he'd come in before, and he'd just, you know, make a little noise, and sometimes it'd be cool. He was never fucking out of line, but this time he started getting out of line, you know. So I told him, hey, old man, you gotta get the fuck out of here. Fuck you, you know. He starts fucking ranting and raving. You know, I'm like, no, you know what? I'm trying to fucking work over here. You gotta get the fuck, fuck you. So finally I go over and I grab him by the shoulders and I turn him around and then I kick him like gently in the ass. And he goes, you know, stumbling out the door and he falls down on his hands and knees, you know, cussing and everything like that. And I close the door, lock, and he bangs on the door or whatever. And then finally walks away. And the next day there was one like resident fucking hipster who was like the king of, you know, old punk rockers or something down there, Jimmy Smack. So Jimmy Smack calls me up and says, oh, Mark, you fucked up. You fucked up. I go, what? He says, oh, that guy you threw out of your shop, you know who that was, right? I'm like, no. And he's like, that's Charles Bukowski. I'm like, that's who that fucking bum was. And he's like, yeah. He goes, oh, you need to apologize to him. I said, fuck that. He needs to apologize to me, you know. But yeah, he was a San Pedro Denison. I'd see him around.
Now, how'd you make your way up to LA?
It was a long road to LA. Worked in this Barrio Bassett. It's between El Monte and La Puente. on a couple of occasions at this pretty cool little secret spot, Fat George's, where quite a lot of good tattooers have worked in this, little shithole over the years. But I worked at Fat George's and then lucky enough to work at Good Time Charlie's on Whittier Boulevard. And then Ed Hardy sold Good Time Charlie's, and Jack Rudy moved the shop to Anaheim, and I worked down there. And then finally I went on my own to Hollywood, to 3rd Street in the late 80s, I guess.
Now, what was 3rd Street like at that time?
3rd Street was dead, man. It was empty storefronts, and there was a print shop and a fortune teller on the block, and an old jewelry store, and then like a bunch of empty storefronts. So it was probably easier to get a landlord to rent you a spot than it would in other places.
And what's it like now?
No, it's super trendy. I was kind of a pioneer down there. It's shortly after I was there was a punk rock shoe store, Nana's, opened up across the street, and it became like a hip little, mini Melrose thing for a minute, and it's kind of gotten more on the upscale thing since then.
So you opened up your first shop on 3rd. What was going on with you personally at the time?
I was strung out, I'm sure, and working it out of the house for the meantime between Anaheim and Mike Ness was the first person that I tattooed at the old Shamrock. I started working on him at the house that morning, and then they called and they said the shop was ready. I'm like, fuck it, Mike, let's go down and work at the new shop. So we did the tattoo down there.
At what point did it become apparent for you that the drug use was getting beyond recreational?
Oh, I'm sure I knew that it was beyond recreational, but I pretty much had no desire to stop, Yeah, that's the downside of having a job where you get paid every day, You can stay strung out without having to steal, And, I had a nice habit for a long period of time. And not until I met my wife did I ever even really think about stopping, And we were together a year probably, and I was at my lowest when I, made the real decision to do it and to go to rehab. But, it was pretty bad, pretty amazing that she put up with me as long as she did and as long as she has since then.
And how long were you in rehab?
That's a funny thing. In those days, rehab was a long fucking deal. I was in there 9 months, man. This place, Cry Help, this kind of old school, hardcore fucking, it was pretty much for junkies by junkies. And at the time, it was starting to have, like some speed freaks and stuff in there. But it was at this, ramshackle old buildings. And, since then it's become this beautiful, fancy hospital-looking place. But it was this funky old series of buildings with the chain link fence around it. And you could watch the people going to cop heroin at this house right across the street for 9 months,
So you get out after 9 months. What happened to the shop?
Well, that's a personal tragedy in that, I had what I thought was a good crew. This guy Bob Vessels that I taught how to tattoo that's still at it, and this other guy Bubba, who was a friend of mine from this punk rock gang that I had tattooed a lot of guys from. And he had just got out of prison. He had been in for murder he committed as a juvenile. And I had a couple other people working for me, but I kind of left them in charge and assumed it'd be a tattoo shop when I got out. But even before I made it in, when I was, kicking off the methadone at home, Bubba announced that it was his tattoo shop and said that he was gunning for me, So I had to fucking pack a gun and, on my way to the methadone and do whatever I had to do before I could get into rehab, which took, a month or so. But, so he took the tattoo shop and everything I owned. And when I got out of rehab, it was gone, He had probably not paid the rent, and the Shamrock Studios didn't exist no more. So, I lost a lot of beautiful old flash, and I came out of rehab with nothing. No tattoo machines, no car, no money, no nothing. And people like Rick Walters and, Mike Brown, and these people kind of helped me out. Rick gave me a couple of great machines and started from scratch again.
Where were you working?
I met a guy in rehab, convict guy who had come out and made a lot of money in selling videos to video phone sales. And I had to get a job for the last period of rehab, and he put me in his phone room trying to sell videos on the phone. I was the worst salesman they ever had. But he had tattooed some in the penitentiary, and he wanted to open up a tattoo shop. So we opened up what was a really beautiful tattoo shop on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks called Mayhem Inc. And we were there maybe 6 or 9 months, and I had a baby, and, we're building up business, starts to be going good, and then the fucking earthquake hit, and the whole place was destroyed, So there I was again, kind of starting from scratch, and I ended up at Tattoo Mania. My friend Gil Mahoney gave me a job, and that's when I got to the Strip, so probably 1990.
And how long were you with Gil Monty?
Yeah, I was at Gil's for, I guess, almost 10 years. And it was a wild-ass place to work, and that was the kind of the end of the rocker era and the beginning of the hip-hop era. So got to, tattoo, the long hairs, and then all of a sudden the business kind of changed, and most of our customers were kind of in the hip-hop world, and that was super interesting, I'm just exposed to different slang and different stories, and I loved it, and Suge Knight was one of my first customers, and we got to be really good friends, and he would bring people in, and, he brought Tupac in, and, I tattooed, Puff Daddy and Mary J. Blige and Method Man and Redman and, a multitude of rappers that I can't even remember, but was real fun. And then Puffy kept calling, wanting me to go to New York and tattoo Biggie. And I was so entrenched with the West Coast, to Death Row, I'd go out and tattoo at Can-Am Studios while Pac was recording. And I, flew around on Suge's jet. And the idea of going to New York, kind of like enemy territory, didn't seem like a good idea for a guy with a baby at home. So I kept putting them off. And then finally, Biggie himself called me up and said, "Yo, Mark, I'm coming to LA. I want to do this tattoo." So we made it happen.
Now, how long after that did the Shamrock Social Club come about?
So I was trying to buy Tattoo Mania from Gil, and I ended up getting outbid at the last moment. So I, begrudgingly went to work for the new owner while I was keeping my eyes open for a spot. And this was a record store. The Shamrock where we're at now is a record store. And I heard they hadn't had a sign up or anything, but I heard the guy was leaving. So I reached out, and I had, by that point, had tried 9 or 10 different storefronts, and everything would be fine until they say, well, what kind of business do you want to run? And you tell them tattoo shop, and they just shake their head, you know. So at least 9 times they told me no. And then I had an appointment with my landlord here, you know, an old white guy, and I wasn't thinking very positive about it. And I came up and met with him, and he's like, well, and he says, you know, 75 or something. And he's like, well, what kind of business do you want to run here? And I tell him a tattoo shop. He's like, oh, great. We ain't had one of those before. Man, he was so cool, man. It was so refreshing. So God bless Robert Peterson. He let us slide right in. And unfortunately, he ended up getting sick and selling it a couple years later. But he also donated his huge car collection to the city of Los Angeles. And it's now the Peterson Auto Museum down on Wilshire, outside of which Biggie got shot 2 days after I tattooed him.
So you open up the Shamrock in 2002.
2001.
2001.
I was supposed to sign the lease on 9/11, and I woke up and I seen that shit happened, and Mr. Peterson called me up and said, let's put this off a day or so. So we signed it on the 12th.
It's not uncommon these days for well-known tattoo artists to open up private studios by themselves, away from everybody else. But you went in the complete opposite direction and created a social club. And I've heard you say oftentimes it's where the elite and the street meet.
Yeah, you know, that comes from an old-time tattooer in the UK from a period of time like in the 19-teens when tattooing was kind of fashionable around the hoi polloi of Europe, and King of Denmark and Winston Churchill's mother, and a bunch of aristocrats were getting tattooed, and a lot of them would go to these guys. This guy named Burchett in London, who also did really fine single needle, beautiful tattoos. And that's what it said on his business card, where the elite and the underworld meet. And, you know, my customers for a long time have been kind of that cross-section right there. And I really like that tattoo shop atmosphere where different kinds of people can be all in there for the same reason, you know. And I remember I had a party when I was in Long Beach, and I didn't have any photographs, and it was starting to be where you had to have a photo album. So I invited all my customers over to my house in the ghetto in Long Beach, and I set up a room to take pictures, and it's early in the evening, and it's, you know, maybe a half a dozen fucking, you know, outlaw motorcycle club guys and a half a dozen punk rock kids. And one of the bikers gets on his bike and he's leaving. I'm like, hey, Stick, where are you going? And he goes, Mark, I'm getting the fuck out of here because this ain't going to be pretty, you know what I mean? These people are too different. It's going to get ugly. It hadn't even crossed my mind that, you know, punk rockers and bikers wouldn't get along, you know? So anyway, he takes off, and we had this fucking wonderful party where all the old bikers loved it. They got to fuck young punk rock girls, and fucking the punk rock guys loved it, and the Vandals played in my living room, and it was a historic party. But I think, you know, tattoos are a great unifier, is what I'm saying, I guess.
How do you define success?
Well, whatever it is, it's eluded me all these years. But in a lot of ways, I'm more successful than I ever dreamt. But I still feel like I'm learning how to tattoo, you know? I still feel like I have a long way to go tattoo-wise, you know? And I think probably success, for an artist is when you can get your artwork to look the same way it does in your head on the skin or on the screen or on the canvas or whatever. And I think that's a elusive thing for a lot of us.
How do you define failure?
Well, that I'm more familiar with, Sometimes it's not doing the stuff you're supposed to do or, using a lot of drugs. And then sometimes it's just bad luck. But failure is kind of when you find yourself, just starting from scratch again, like we've kind of talked about, that when you find yourself with nothing.
Can you think of a failure, either personally or professionally, that ultimately set you up for success?
I guess in a way, losing a couple of tattoo shops and, even, coming that close to buying Tattoo Mania and not being able to do that, it definitely made me want the Shamrock to be a success, and it made me want to work hard or do whatever it had to do to make it happen.
How do you define happiness?
Happiness is making other people happy. When my family's doing good or my customer is happy, that makes me happy.
What would you say to 18-year-old Mark?
I would say it's going to be a rough road, you know what I mean? It's going to have its bumps, but keep cruising,
How would you describe what you do for a living?
Draw funny little pictures on people, but I guess, the goal is to make people feel better about themselves and feel good about themselves. That's my goal.
Mark Mahoney, thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, shit, no, thank you. That was painless. It's fun.
The Days Between is a production of Noah Abrams Studio. Story editing by Andrew Henry. Mixing and mastering by Greg Henkin. Website and design by John Fisher. Theme music is by Evo. The Days Between can be found online at www.thedaysbetweenpodcast.com and on Instagram at The Days Between Podcast. My name is Noah Abrams. Thanks for listening.